Well, hello and welcome, and thanks so much for joining me today for episode 6 of season 4 of the Healthy Skeptic MD podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Hockman. I want to begin again today by thanking Scan Health Plan for funding the Healthy Skeptic MD. And today, my topic is once again going to be homelessness. I've been focusing a lot on the issue of homelessness this season because, first of all, sadly, in the wake of the pandemic, rates of homelessness have increased quite a bit. And the second reason, of course, as I mentioned before, is that I'm going to be leading a new medical group focused on caring for patients experiencing homelessness. And in this work, I have met a lot of interesting people. And one of the most interesting I've met with yet is my guest today. He's someone who has deep experience, more than 30 years, working with this population. That's Mr. John Maceri, who is the CEO of the People Concern, which is one of the largest social services providers on the West Coast. They're based here in Los Angeles, actually in Santa Monica. And John is going to, he really has fascinating insights on this issue. He's thought about it from every imaginable angle. And I really do recommend that you stick around if you want to understand and unpack the issue of homelessness. If you do find today's episode engaging, please do search and subscribe to the Healthy Skeptic MD wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Search for Healthy Skeptic MD on YouTube. Pass it along to friends, family, and others who might be interested. And if you do have a chance, please do consider leaving a review. Before we jump into our interview today with John, as always, let's start with a rundown of the health news of the week. And the first topic I wanted to touch on was COVID in children. So one of the saving graces, of course, of this pandemic is that kids do very, very well with COVID. And with kids going back to school this month, there's been a real uptick in media articles discussing the potential risks of this. In particular, there was a New York Times article looking at long COVID in kids. And there's also been some anecdotal reports about Southern hospital ICUs having a spike in pediatric patients. So I spent a little time this week digging into the literature to see if anything has changed. Maybe it is that COVID is getting more severe in children. So my conclusion from this is that really nothing has changed and that kids do very well. So first, in terms of the New York Times article, there was a statistic that caught a lot of people's attention that suggested that somewhere between 11 to 15% of kids get long COVID. But I looked at the reference there, and basically what they did is they took kids who had an infection and they asked them every week repeatedly if they had any symptoms. And not surprisingly, many did several weeks after the infection. And this would be seen with the flu, with mono, even common colds. I will tell my patients to expect a good 6 weeks until their symptoms have completely resolved. And of course, this is confounded in COVID because you're at home isolated. So there might be some psychological component to some of these symptoms. The best analysis I did find was a UK study that found that after 8 weeks, 98% of kids were completely back to normal. So I don't want to totally downplay the concerns related to long COVID, but, compared to other childhood viruses, nothing I see really raises alarm bells there. Now, in terms of the reports of hospitalizations, I looked at the CDC data, and as of July 31st, the last week for which data are available, the rates were 0.6 per 100,000, which is very, very low. The peak last January was 1.5 per 100,000, so quite a bit higher than they are now. And even that is a very low rate. So now, in fairness, we do want to follow things. Hospitalizations do lag. So, we definitely want to keep a close eye on hospitalization rates. But everything that I've seen so far does not raise any alarm bells, at least in terms of the objective data. So I really hope that these media reports don't dissuade policymakers and school leaders from getting schools reopened, because it is so important for the psychological and mental health of kids, not to mention their parents, to get those classrooms back open. So secondly, I want to do a quick rundown of some interesting health studies that have come out over the last couple of weeks. So the first has to do with a treatment called platelet-rich plasma therapy. So this is something of a fad treatment that's being used, unfortunately, with increasing frequency for a variety of ailments. And what's going on here is that a patient's plasma with the platelets still in it is injected back into their body. So one of the first rigorous studies of this treatment was published this week in JAMA for patients with a Achilles tendonitis, and not surprisingly, it did not show a benefit. So if a doctor or someone else suggests platelet-rich plasma therapy to you, maybe you should be skeptical of this one. The second study is also a JAMA analysis, and it found that the proportion of calories that children consume from ultra-processed foods, highly processed foods, has increased over the last 20 years from 61% to 67%. So 2/3 of the calories kids are getting, sadly, is from ultra-processed foods. So this is a good reminder for all of us to really try as best we can to stay away from that processed foods, try to stick around the outer aisles of the grocery store, as Michael Pollan always says. So the final study, to end on a positive note, relates to an episode we did a couple weeks ago with Dr. Mark Walters. It was a report in the New England Journal in which doctors edited the DNA of liver cells in patients with a rare protein disorder, and the preliminary results were very encouraging. And it's particularly noteworthy because they did the gene editing in the patient's body as opposed to in the test tube. So this is a real big step here. And as we talked about in that episode with Dr. Mark Walters, I really think this is going to be an exciting field that's going to change medicine over the next couple decades. So with that, let's jump into our interview today with John Maceri. Well, welcome to the Healthy Skeptic, MD, John Maceri.
Hi, Michael. It's nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining. You've got such an interesting background and history in this field, and we'll go through it all. But let's start at the beginning. How did you become interested in working with populations experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a long story, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. I've been at the agency 22 years now, and prior to that, for 12 years, I worked as the director of an AIDS service organization. We did residential care and supportive housing for people living with HIV and AIDS, although we started off originally back when in the middle of the AIDS epidemic providing hospice care. And so I've been working in the housing area for over 30 years now, and I've always wanted to work with disenfranchised people. And so I left in 1999 when AIDS was moving towards a more chronically manageable disease because of the early interventions and treatments that were becoming available in the late 90s, which when I started in the mid-80s just didn't exist, and moved to what was then the Ocean Park Community Center, OPCC, in Santa Monica, that had a broader population program participants, so people experiencing homelessness and victims of domestic violence primarily. So I've always had a heart, and I felt a calling for working with poor and disenfranchised people, and so here I am.
Well, I always have to say it's so interesting. Everyone has a different story about how they got connected with homeless populations, but in many cases it is working with some vulnerable community that just catches you and it brings you here. Well, anecdotally, I think we've all seen more people living on the streets, under highway underpasses. What trends have you seen, and are these anecdotal observations backed up by data? Are the actual numbers of homeless increasing?
Yeah, I don't think it's anecdotal. I think certainly in the last couple of years, if you go anywhere in the city and county of Los Angeles, there is a significant increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness. I mean, the visible manifestations on our streets are significant, and not just in areas that traditionally had seen large numbers of people living on the streets. So, for a very long time, Skid Row, of course, was kind of the epicenter, South LA, pockets on the west side. But now we have seen that has expanded to the San Fernando Valley, San Gabriel Valley, the high desert. I mean, there is no part of the county you don't see visible homelessness increasing, both in terms of individuals, encampments, large-scale encampments, both outside as well as vehicle encampments as well. So we absolutely have seen the numbers increasing, and there are a variety of reasons, for that. The pandemic didn't create these numbers. I mean, all of the social determinants of health and all of the issues that create homelessness were present prior to the pandemic. What the pandemic did was sort of accelerate, I think, a lot of these issues that have been in place in Los Angeles for a long time. We've had a deficit of affordable housing for decades, this is a problem that is decades in the making, and essentially we've reaped what we've sown. We've disinvested in affordable housing development and permanent supportive housing, specifically targeting people living on the streets and people with severe disabilities living on the streets. And so, as a result now, we find ourselves in a situation where we have a very expensive and tight real estate market. We have stagnant wages, and we have, more and more people losing their housing and ending up on the streets.
One question I get asked all the time, in terms of the pandemic, is it that people have lost their job and then they go into homelessness, or is it just a steady increase in housing prices, or is it a surge in mental illness perhaps triggered by the pandemic, or is it maybe a little bit of all of the above?
It is all of the above. There is no single driver into homelessness. I mean, people become homeless in a variety of ways. So we certainly have seen what I would describe as kind of economic refugees, people who were working, maybe in some cases still are working, and they just simply can't afford the rent, so they lose their housing. And most Angelenos are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. So we have many people that are paying 40, 50% of their income, and in some communities as high as 70 or 80% of their income is going just to pay for housing. So that doesn't leave very much for additional expenses, and it doesn't take very much to push people over the edge. So certainly there are some people that fall into homelessness who fall into that category. Then we have, folks who have struggled for a long time to be able to afford housing, and they may go in and out of housing. They may be housed for a while and then lose their housing and get rehoused. They may be folks who are couch surfing, sharing housing with friends or relatives. And then we have, a large number of folks who are chronically homeless, who have been on the streets for a long period of time, who are by definition living with a disability, usually mental illness, substance addiction, or chronic health conditions, or some combination often of all of those. And for women and children, domestic violence is a big driver of homelessness.
Well, as a doctor, when I see patients experiencing homelessness, I often feel like when you see one homeless patient, you've seen one homeless patient, because everybody's story is so different and so nuanced, and the answer, as you said, really has to be tailored to their needs. And there's lessons to be learned, but everybody's story is unique.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that, I often say that I really think we should not use the term the homeless as if homeless people are a homogenous group of people, because they're not. Everybody is unique. There's certainly, you see similarities and you see trends in certain populations for sure. I mean, the thing that people experiencing homelessness share, which is something we all share, is they've experienced a lot of trauma in their lives. And so, their ability both to cope with that trauma and to overcome that trauma depends a lot on the resources and support that they have available to them. So, we all experience trauma in our life, but our ability to be resilient is often dependent on what kinds of supports and resources we have.
So, John, we've been talking about Los Angeles, and in many cases, big urban areas like LA are sort of the canary in the coal mine for the nation. Are these same trends that we're seeing here in Los Angeles also going on nationwide?
Yeah, I think we're seeing an increase in homelessness playing out across the country, certainly in the large urban areas. So, along the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, but, New York, Chicago, the areas across the country, especially in larger urban areas, we're seeing an increase. There are some communities that have been able to decrease the number of people experiencing homelessness, but certainly over the last year, the pandemic has, as I said, accelerated these numbers in ways that we haven't seen for a while. And in communities, prior to the pandemic, we were starting to see some numbers trending down, but that is not the case currently.
So, John, as I mentioned to you, we are starting a new medical group, Healthcare in Action, affiliated with the SCAN group, to try to address some of the medical needs, the health needs, including mental health of patients experiencing homelessness. To what extent, in your view, are health and homelessness linked?
Well, I think they are linked in a very significant way. I mean, addressing the health needs of people experiencing homelessness is huge. We see it play out in different ways. People experiencing homelessness are high utilizers often of hospital emergency departments, for instance. So you see that people will go into hospital emergency rooms, often not because they have an acute medical condition, although most of them have chronic health conditions, medical, both physical and often mental health issues that they need addressed. But they go into the emergency department. By law, they need to be stabilized medically, and then they're discharged, usually back to the streets. That's not the hospital's fault. The hospital is not in the business of housing people long term. But what we see is this revolving door, and it utilizes very expensive and precious medical resources that really could be better used to treat emergencies, and it doesn't really do anything to address the long-term health needs of those patients. And so, fortunately in Los Angeles, there's been a movement for a while, and I'm very excited about the work that SCAN is doing that you'll be heading up, because I think that this is an area that when we look at systems change and improvement, sort of addressing the healthcare needs of people experiencing homelessness, is a major intersection with what is often driving people into homelessness and often keeping people homeless. So if we can find a way to get our arms around these patients, address and treat their ongoing medical needs, keep them out of the emergency departments and out of the inpatient units unless it's absolutely necessary for them to be hospitalized or treated in the ER. What we'll see over the long term is that these patients then should be connected to organizations in the community that will provide housing and wraparound services.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a policy debate about what the root cause is. Is it housing or is it health that's the problem? And the root cause, you might go after first. So, do you focus first on getting people housed and then treat their health conditions, or vice versa? And, it really seems like a chicken or egg situation. You really have to do both at the same time, which is why we are so excited to work with organizations like yours, because we can't do it alone. And by the same token, I think housing programs without the health component are going to have their barriers too. So with that, you lead the People Concern, a Los Angeles-based organization. Could you tell us a little bit about the People Concern? What services do you offer, and what's your mission?
Sure. Well, the People Concern was formed about 5 years ago in the merger between what was then the Ocean Park Community Center, OPCC, in Santa Monica, and Lamp Community, which is based in downtown in Skid Row. What a lot of people don't know is that Lamp Community was actually started by a woman named Molly Lowry, who was one of my predecessors at OPCC. I was the director of OPCC, but Molly was the director from 1976 to 1984, and always wanted to work with seriously mentally ill people in Skid Row. And so she left OPCC in 84 and went downtown, and in 1985 opened Lamp Community, and always hoped that the two organizations would be combined. And she passed away a couple of years ago, and before that happened, she sort of saw that dream realized. So I'm very happy to lead what is now the People Concern, which is Lamp Community and OPCC United. So we are a nonprofit housing and service provider that provides everything from street outreach, multidisciplinary street outreach teams. So we have a healthcare provider, a mental health care provider, substance abuse, and then people with lived experience that go out every single day and are in public spaces in Skid Row, on the west side, and beaches and parks and any public space where people experiencing homelessness are, and are building connections and trusting relationships with them with the ultimate goal of getting them connected to housing and services. We operate several interim housing facilities. These are bridge facilities for people who are leaving the streets and on their way to permanent supportive housing. We're supporting about 2,400 people in permanent housing across Los Angeles County, so from Antelope Valley down to Long Beach, where these are people that are living in permanent units with wraparound services, and that includes primary care, mental health care, substance use, and domestic violence services. So in a very broad way, it's really kind of begins with street outreach and ends with permanent supportive housing. And our retention rates are 92%, meaning that 92% of the people we house never are homeless again. And that retention rate is really based on the wraparound services. So to the point you made earlier, Michael, is it housing, is it health? It's both. It's not either or, it's and both.
I just want to repeat that 92% number. It's really impressive. As a doctor, I've cared for a lot of patients who are homeless at the county hospital and community health centers. And my success rate is so much lower. And I think that is a reflection of not having a partner that has the longitudinal wraparound services that your organization provides. Just so I make sure I understand that statistic correctly, these are people who, once they get into permanent supportive housing, that they stay there?
Correct.
And what's the success rate, for the people that you do street outreach on? What percentage of them are you able to get into that pipeline, into transitional housing and then to permanent housing?
Yeah, that really depends, Michael, honestly, on the individual and how long we're able to work with someone. I think this is something I think that, anyone listening to this podcast might have a hard time understanding, because I think most of us think if we ever found ourselves homeless and someone approached us and said, hey, we'd like to talk to you about housing, would you be interested in that? We'd like to, help you get off the street, that we would jump into their arms and say, of course, I want that. But that's not the way it works. And if you've worked with individuals, especially people struggling with mental illness or substance addiction, which is a very high percentage of the people that our outreach teams are working with, it often takes a very long time to build a trusting relationship and to engage those individuals. That said, our approach is really relentless engagement. So, we don't give up on people. No today doesn't mean no forever. And we often find sometimes it takes weeks, months, years in some cases to overcome those barriers. But eventually, we have found over, my arc of 22 years, here at the agency, that eventually most people will engage at some point. And it often, frankly, takes something significant happening in their lives. Kind of the intersection between homelessness and health. It's often a medical emergency where someone gets very sick on the street, needs to be hospitalized. Literally they're going to die, or they have a very significant psychotic episode, or perhaps even if they're using substances, an overdose is often, not always, but often the triggering point, the turning point in people's lives.
Well, one insight along those lines that I didn't have until I started working with homeless patients is exactly that just offering housing in many cases isn't enough. In many cases, people, they have a community on the streets. And just as we all have neighbors and community, they do too. And it may not be a healthful environment to be in. It may not be a productive environment to be in, but it's one that they're comfortable with. And if you put them into a housing situation where they don't know people, they don't have the supports they need, it can be a lot worse than where they came from. So you need to create a transition with those supportive services, as you said, where people don't feel isolated when they first get into the housing.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just about providing services. It's really about building community in the housing as well, because, people do have social networks. They aren't often the healthiest social networks, and they're often, built on kind of dysfunctional relationships and things that aren't necessarily, good for those individuals. But nonetheless, that's the community, and those are the relationships that people have. So, part of, providing wraparound services is understanding that the transition into housing can often be lonely and isolating, especially for people who haven't lived indoors for a long time. Adjusting to life indoors is, again, it's sort of counterintuitive to the way I think most of us think.
So it really is a more complex problem than just providing the housing support. Now, at the risk of asking a little bit of a politically sensitive question here, there's been a lot of investment in housing, certainly here in California. $12 billion is in the governor's budget. LA City, it's $1 billion. The county also has its Measure H program. But there's also been critiques that these funds are not always spent in the most efficient way. There's been a number running around that it's $600,000 it's taking the city or the county to build a unit of housing, which is a lot. Can you comment on the extent to which these funds are being spent efficiently?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot here to unpack, and I think it's, we're kind of conflating several issues. Let me start with the cost per unit for permanent supportive housing. And it is true that the average unit cost is $550,000 and climbing. And why is that? Because I think, again, anybody listening to this podcast who doesn't work in this world would say, well, that's outrageous. I think that most Angelenos would say, well, at that much we could buy people a house or a condo, or, I work hard, I put my kids through college and they're living at home with me because they can't afford to buy a house, and yet we're spending this much money to build one unit of housing for people experiencing homelessness. So I totally understand people's frustration. So why is that? There are a variety of reasons. One, land costs and construction in Los Angeles are expensive. This is a high cost area to live and to build. We have a lot of regulatory barriers for developers that add to the time and the cost of development. NIMBY resistance, frankly, especially for affordable housing and permanent supportive housing projects.
And NIMBY, of course, being not in my backyard.
It's not in my backyard, yes, not in my backyard. So when neighbors come and protest the affordable housing development, and we hear this often, and say, I'm not against housing the homeless, however, but, don't do it here, do it, send them all to the desert or wherever, which is just not practical and isn't going to happen. So delays in construction add to the cost of building as well. And then we have a lot of bureaucratic barriers, frankly, locally that are, permits, entitlements that are not as streamlined. So all of these things contribute, as well as the way we currently finance affordable housing development. It's a very slow and cumbersome process that costs a lot of money. So, what can we do about that? Well, I'm not saying we should stop building affordable housing, but I do think we have to get smarter and build faster and cheaper. And I don't mean cheaper in terms of quality, but I mean the per unit cost needs to come down substantially. And so we're starting to see some movement in this area, looking at modular and prefab. Those technologies are emerging. They've been around for a while. They haven't been used in wide scale production for housing for homeless people. But on the permanent side, we certainly can look at those technologies. We can look at the way we finance housing, using social impact investing, not using tax credit financing. So private individuals and investment companies, could put up the money for the acquisition and pre-development money. We could streamline that process by a couple of years. We could shave off, $550,000 in 3 to 5 years to put up a project is simply too expensive and it takes too long. And I understand why Angelenos are frustrated. And in terms of the additional money, that is coming in, I think it's a great opportunity. And the current administration, federal level, has certainly made a significant investment in terms of rental subsidies, vouchers, which are great. It will not increase the number of available units. So again, we sort of go back to, all roads lead to housing and all roads lead to the production of more units, because we need places for people to live, not just people experiencing homelessness. I mean, affordable housing is a problem for working class people. It's a problem for college students. It's a problem, generally. With 60,000 people, experiencing homelessness, we cannot, the current rate, it would take, $34 billion in 100 years just to house the number of people that we have on the streets now, and that's not even including the number of people that are continuing to fall into homelessness.
Yeah, well, just simple math, it seems there's more people falling into homelessness each month than the rate at which the units are being built, so the numbers are increasing. Along those lines, you mentioned some of the private approaches to building houses faster and maybe less expensive. Some of them have even gotten some good media attention around here. What's your take on some of these private approaches?
Well, I'm excited about them, and we've been a huge advocate at the People Concern. Several years ago, our Permanent Supportive Housing Committee, which for a long time, frankly, worked with traditional, affordable, and permanent supportive housing developers. They're, great people doing important work, but they are working in a system that's fundamentally broken. And so we set out to sort of answer the question, how can we do this, better? I mean, how can we really have an impact and come up with a model that's scalable and sustainable? And we incubated a developer called Flyaway Homes, which has become their own nonprofit, who started off doing modified shipping containers, the first two projects, and now are looking at doing modular manufactured, housing. And they're not the only developers. There are more developers that are moving into this, area. Essentially, the idea was that if we could create a predictable system of production over time, that we could, in fact, get to a place where we could scale the production of housing. So it would be much more streamlined. And on the front end, it would be financed not by low-income tax credits, but by what we called social impact investing, which is not a new, concept, but essentially it's private individuals. So it could be individual investors, or it could be investment firms or family foundations. It could be any number of sources of capital that put up the money for the land acquisition, the pre-development, the construction cost, and then at the end, when the buildings are leased up, a small return on that investment goes back to the investor.
Well, my focus has been more on the healthcare side, so I'm far from an expert, but from what I've read, it really does sound exciting, some of these modular prefab options with private developers. I've worked for the county. There's such good people wanting to do the right thing, but it is too bureaucratic from what I've seen. So I am enthusiastic to see some private alternative options that maybe can be more efficient and get the job done a little bit better. One other issue, John, that you've been very active on is support and fair pay for the people who do this type of work. As you mentioned before, you have some people with lived experience, meaning they were previously homeless, who are doing the outreach now. What's a typical hourly wage, and what do you think is fair?
Well, yeah, thank you for raising this, Michael, because it is one of my passions, and I think it's not endemic just to the homeless service delivery system. It's endemic to the nonprofit sector, and this has been an issue that has been lifted up by many people. I mean, locally, the Center for Nonprofit Management and Cal Nonprofits have been working on this, but we have been very strong and frankly vocal advocates at the federal level, and will continue to be, for full cost reimbursement on providing these services. So I'll just give you some specific examples. For a long time in the nonprofit sector, and it continues to this day. I mean, I was just having a conversation yesterday with a city bureaucrat about a city contract that doesn't pay the full cost. And the attitude is, well, you work in the nonprofit sector, you just leverage. This is an overused term. The nonprofit sector is leveraged to the hilt. So the expectation is if it costs $1 to provide the service, often government or other funders will say, well, we'll give you 75 or 80 cents, and then you go find the other 20 cents. Well, that's not practical, and it's not sustainable. And so what it ends up doing is it undervalues and underpays people who are doing some of the most difficult and incredible work. So to your question specifically, typically outreach workers now are somewhere in the $17 to $20 range, maybe a little bit higher if people have been in the field longer. I would say a baseline wage should be probably somewhere in the $24 to $26 range, which works out to about $50,000, $52,000 a year. So,
and just to be clear, those in some parts of the country that may seem like a very good wage, but in Los Angeles, the cost of living, it's right. Very hard in Los Angeles to live on that.
Exactly, Michael. And so that, everything, of course, is relative, right? But in Los Angeles, we're talking about, that translates to $42,000 a year when the average one-bedroom apartment rents for $2,400 a month. You do the math, and that, by the way, that's gross before taxes. So, it's one of the struggles, frankly, I have as a leader, of an organization that employs not just people with lived experience, but for all of our employees that we have continued to fight.
Well, we are in the process of hiring community health workers for our medical program right now. And I have to say that the most fun thing I've done in my job is to get to go out and try and hire some of these individuals. They're so appreciative of salaries that I think to many of us would not be very reasonable. And just how appreciative that they are of the opportunity to work and how important I think it's going to be to their own success in maintaining and sustaining their success personally while being able to give back and help others. So these are really important jobs, and I'm totally aligned with your perspective that we need to fight and advocate for these jobs. So, John, I have just a couple final questions for you on some policy topics that have generated some media attention. So, Judge David Carter is got some attention earlier this year in Los Angeles because he ordered that every person living in the Skid Row community be offered housing by this fall, by October. And there's been some pushback. On the other hand, there have been people who have really been inspired by what he's called on folks to do. What's your, and there may not be an exact right or wrong answer here, but what's your perspective on that order?
Well, I think what Judge Carter's done and what I appreciate is that he's brought a sense of urgency and accountability, primarily to the electeds, to the city and county government that I think has been lacking for a very long time. And I think we need to be clear that the idea that nothing was happening in terms of housing or providing services to people before Judge Carter came along is just simply inaccurate. I think what Judge Carter has done, though, has been a catalyst to sort of bring this issue front and center and, as I said, accountability and really hold people's feet, to the fire. That said, what I would say on the other side of it is that from a policy perspective, I think we have to be careful not to get into these either or conversations. Either you invest all of your resources and you house people in temporary facilities, now, or you wait and until everyone can be permanently housed. And my feeling about that from a policy perspective is you don't do one or the other. You need to do both. You need to do both simultaneously. And so I think from a policy perspective, the question we have to be asking is, if we are going to put up a lot of temporary interventions, and that's what they are, they're interventions, they are not solutions because people are still going to be homeless. Then the question is, what's next? What's the next iteration of housing for these individuals?
Well, I also support, the sense of urgency that the order has added. And I really think he's coming from a good place. He's someone who's been out, under the bridges, talking to homeless individuals. I really give him a lot of credit for that. Based on my anecdotal experience, I do worry whether offering somebody temporary housing is going to have a meaningful impact, without the healthcare services, without the care management wraparound. Many of that, I'm not sure that those offers are going to go anywhere in many cases. But, again, I think it did add a sense of urgency. And, for that reason, I'll be interested to see how it plays out. The other big policy issue here locally in Los Angeles, the LA City Council a couple of weeks ago passed a measure, and I want to read it, restricting homelessness encampments with bans on sitting, lying, sleeping, or storing personal property that blocks sidewalks, streets, bike lanes, or near driveways, fire hydrants, schools, daycare centers, libraries, homeless shelters, and parks. So basically putting some real major restrictions on where homeless individuals can set up their tents. What's your take on this one?
Well, again, Michael, I think that in some ways this is a reaction to sort of the general consensus, of people are fed up, and there is always this push and pull between not criminalizing people for experiencing homelessness who have no other place to go but to be in public spaces, and then how far do you let the expansion of encampments, go. And I think that has been, certainly over the last couple of years, the last year during the pandemic, but coming out of the pandemic and even prior to the pandemic, but certainly in the last year or so, just the extreme growth of encampments and I think it's less, as I talk to people, I think it's less about people being outdoors. It's more about the trash and sort of the collection of stuff that is not, there's a big difference between people's personal belongings, their clothing, their medications, their identification, the tent that they're living in, their sleeping materials. There's a big difference between that and then mounds and mounds of trash and debris and things that continue to grow as encampments and grow. And so I think this ordinance is in many ways a reaction to appease constituents who are rightfully upset, and feel like the public spaces, the parks especially, but sidewalks, other areas that are used by everybody in the community have been completely taken over and co-opted.
Well, it's such a complex issue. We have little kids and we take them to the parks and, on the one hand, my experience in my day job, I understand the challenges, but on the other hand, you just don't want your kids too close to, there's real risks and dangers there. And it is complicated. Well, John, I have one final question to finish up on today. Why should we be optimistic?
That's a great question. In spite of everything, I think we should be optimistic because homelessness is solvable. I mean, that there is not, a person working in this space that I know that gets up in the morning scratching their head saying, gee, we don't know what to do. We know exactly what to do. We need to house people and we need to provide the appropriate level of wraparound supports to keep people housed. I mean, that sounds simplistic, but the fact of the matter is that's what it takes. What we need are the resources and, frankly, folks to get out of the way and let us, get the job done. So I still believe that there's opportunity, here in Los Angeles, across the country, but we're focused on Los Angeles here, that we cannot, at the current pace and the current systems, we cannot build our way out of this anytime soon. We have to be innovative. You said something about Judge Carter bringing a sense of urgency. I completely agree with that. We need to treat this as the public health. This is a public health and a public safety emergency, but mostly a public health emergency, both for the people who are living outdoors, but for all Angelenos. And if we attack it in that way, if we bring a sense of urgency, if we streamline, our ability to construct new housing, we have to lean into new technologies, new ways of financing. We have to build faster and cheaper. If we can do those things and stay focused on those things, then I think we have every reason to be optimistic.
I think that's very well said. It really is about execution. We don't need some fancy new technology to come in. I think we're getting unprecedented levels of attention. And, I think if you and I didn't think it was solvable, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. So I think that's a nice way to end on. Well, John Maceri from The People Concern, thank you so much for joining me today. I learned a lot from hearing your perspective and really appreciate the work that you've done for vulnerable communities throughout your career. If you did find today's episode engaging, please do search and subscribe to The Healthy Skeptic MD wherever you listen to podcasts. Pass it along to friends, family, and others who might be interested, and leave us a review if you have a chance. We'll pick it up again in a couple weeks. Thanks for joining me today.